ونحن حينما نصارح بسياستنا لا يهمنا أن يزعل الغرب أو أن يتكدر الشرق.
Power, fear, influence. These three leaders had it all. They ruled their nations with unmatched authority, shook the world with their decisions, and shaped history in ways few others could. Their names commanded respect and, in some cases, fear. But despite their power, they all met a shocking end. Not in exile, not in secrecy, but in broad daylight for the world to see. These were not just leaders. They were giants of modern history. So how did they rise to such power? And why were they taken down in such a brutal way? On March 25, 1975, a young Saudi prince snuck into a waiting room with two senior officers. When the door to King Faisal's office was opened at 10:32 a.m., the young prince walked in behind the two ministers. And when King Faisal leaned over to embrace his young nephew, the young man took out a pistol and shot 6 rounds of close range. The first shot hit the king's chin, piercing his throat and ripping through his jugular vein. The second bullet went through his ear and grazed his temple. One of the most powerful and feared leader of the recent times was assassinated by his own nephew. There's a reason why this happened, which will become clear by the end of this story. Faisal ibn Abdulaziz al Saud was born in the royal house of Saud. He was the third son of King Abdulaziz, the founder of modern-day Saudi Arabia. Faisal's date of birth is not officially confirmed, as birth certificates were unavailable in the region of Hijaz at that time. However, some have estimated that he may have been born in the year 1905. Faisal is an old traditional Arabic name, meaning sword. He spent much of his early years under the attentive guardianship of his maternal grandfather. His grandfather molded his character and influenced his personality in a very profound way. From a very young age, Faisal's mother would habitually encourage and motivate him to cultivate and develop the proud nomadic traits of courage, generosity, and above all else, religious piety and sincerity. But the loving inspiration and maternal cheer that the young prince was so accustomed to in these early years were to be disrupted prematurely when his beloved mother died in the year 1912. Faisal was only 7 years old at that time. The young prince soon found solace and serenity under the care of his maternal grandfather. He was an inspiration and a mentor for the tender soul. Prince Faisal's experience was remarkable because, unlike his brothers, he had lived with desert dwellers and was learned in their traditions. He knew their dialects and understood the subtleties of classical Arabic poetry. Faisal's childhood experience in the open desert enabled him to learn how to ride horses, how to hunt with falcons, how to shoot rifles, and even how to handle swords. In addition to these useful abilities, Faisal's uncles taught him military strategies and tactics, as well as customs and histories of the Arab tribes surrounding them. He was well versed in their heritage. He knew about their blood feuds. He even learned to recognize their grazing patterns. Above all, the young prince was an ardent apprentice of desert diplomacy, a skill which he had come to learn directly under his father, King Abdul Aziz, the unrivaled champion. Consequently, these early experiences would serve the young prince a great deal in later years. Prince Faisal was a unique product of the untainted environment of an open desert. As a son of the soil, he understood the common dialects of his people and participated in everyday activities, from herding camels to shooting arrows in the wilderness. Faisal had surpassed his brothers in many respects and was perhaps one of the king's most promising children. This was a sentiment that was evident from the king's own expressions. King Abdul Aziz would often make the following remark concerning his third son: "Oh, I only wish I had 3 Faisals." Faisal's brilliance and natural intelligence would soon be tested when in 1919 the British government invited King Abdul Aziz to visit London on a diplomatic mission. However, with the recent death of his older son and with concerns over the domestic situation, the king sent his 14-year-old son Faisal to represent him. These diplomatic assignments made Faisal the very first Saudi royal to visit the United Kingdom. He traveled with a cousin who was raised in Turkey, along with a merchant who spoke English. They were all accompanied by several guards. Yet despite his new surroundings and the alien culture that engrossed his 14-year-old mind, Faisal had not forgotten his upbringing back in the desert of Arabia. The morning following his arrival in the United Kingdom, Prince Faisal and his entourage were forcefully removed from their hotel room. After having made the morning call to prayers, thereby waking up the entire hotel, Faisal spent all but 5 months in Britain, wherein he met with the king and high-ranking British officials. During the same period, he also visited France, where he was saluted as the first Saudi royal to visit there also. Furthermore, during his stay in Britain, King George invited Prince Faisal and his entourage to Buckingham Palace in the spirit of hospitality. However, when he was asked what he liked most about the country, the young prince replied that he particularly enjoyed riding up and down the long escalators in Piccadilly Circus. The teenager learned a few phrases in English and gained a fresh new insight into the world outside the Desert Kingdom. In fact, he became the country's de facto foreign minister at the age of 14, and he continued to serve in that position until the day he died. Upon the death of King Abdulaziz and the succession of Prince Faisal's elder brother, King Saud, in 1953, Prince Faisal was subsequently appointed crown prince. But in 1958, due to growing unrest concerning the new king's financial ineptitude, many members of the royal family, along with senior members of the religious establishment, were actively calling for the appointment of Prince Faisal to the office of Prime Minister, thereby endorsing the motion that Prince Faisal should be granted wide executive powers to support his elder brother with decision-making. Once appointed to the rank of Prime Minister, Prince Faisal initiated a massive reform that dramatically reduced unnecessary expenditure and lavish projects within the kingdom. Faisal had diligently worked to rescue the state treasury from bankruptcy. His policy of financial conservativeness was to become a symbol of his good judgment and earned him a reputation for prudence and moderation. However, not long after his appointment, Prince Faisal was at the center of a power struggle between himself and the reigning monarch, King Saud. But on 18 December 1960, Prince Faisal resigned as Prime Minister, expressing his concern that King Saud was jeopardizing his financial reform and reversing the positive impact of his policies. King Saud therefore revoked Faisal's executive powers and appointed his other brother, Prince Talal, to the executive post of Finance Minister. However, by 1962, Prince Faisal had rallied enough support within the royal family to reinstall himself as Prime Minister for a second time. And during his second term as Prime Minister, Prince Faisal was successful in being able to cement his reputation as a reformer and an agent for development and modernization within the kingdom. Prince Faisal was the first Saudi monarch to introduce female education. Despite the consternation of many conservatives in the traditional institutions, he challenged the social norms and championed the cause for women to achieve proficiency in reading, writing, and arithmetic. A delegation of objectors soon approached Prince Faisal in an attempt to revoke his plan toward female education in the kingdom. Their concerns were rebuffed by Faisal's bold challenge to present just one verse in the Quran wherein women were forbidden to read and write.
طب لو الملك فيصل ما أخذ خطوة وساند المرأة لأنه هو يعلمها كان هيحصل فين؟
Prince Faisal's own wife was deeply involved in championing the cause for female education. Prince Faisal also supported the establishment of the Islamic University of Medina in 1961. And in 1962, he also championed the establishment of the Muslim World League organization. In November 1964, Prince Faisal was designated to the throne in favor of his elder brother, the former King Saud. But Prince Faisal is reported to have refused the honor 3 times until he was eventually forced upon him. In a passionate inaugural ceremony, following his royal appointment on November 2, 1964, King Faisal declared the following words: "I beg of you, brothers, to look upon me as a brother and a servant. Majesty is reserved for God alone, and the throne is the throne of the heavens and earth." Upon his accession, King Faisal still viewed the restoration of the country's finances as his main priority. He continued to pursue his judicious financial policies during the first years of his reign, and his aims of balancing the country's budget eventually succeeded and were further advanced by an increase in oil production. King Faisal now embarked on a full-blown modernization program. The peak of his achievements was the establishment of a judicial system. Many universities were established or expanded during his rule. Many of the country's current ministries, government agencies, and welfare programs were established during his rule. He invested heavily in infrastructure. He also introduced policies such as agriculture and industrial subsidies, as well as pension plans and social insurance programs for the Saudi workforce. When King Faisal descended to the throne, there were only 317 rial in the royal treasury vault, a measly sum of little over $50. So the king initiated a sweeping program that would limit and minimize excessive allowances being paid to members of the royal family at the expense of the public. As a result of these courageous initiatives and measures, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was now on the road to financial stability and prosperity. King Faisal built many schools and established several mosques. He even dug wells in the Bedouin region and spent his own money towards settling debts and medical bills of local merchants and tribesmen. In fact, King Faisal spent 50 times more towards the educational budget in 1 year than had been previously spent by the administration before him. Then in 1964, King Faisal hired the National Broadcast Company, better known as NBC, to set up 4 TV stations in Riyadh, Jeddah, Medina, and Daman. The first television broadcasts were officially transmitted in July 1965. In 1966, an especially zealous nephew of King Faisal, by the name of Khalid ibn Mosayyid, led a group of armed protesters in an attempt to destroy the television station in Riyadh. King Faisal had informed the officers to retaliate if the prince should open fire, reminding everyone that no one was above the law, not even a prince. When the police arrived to disperse the group, Prince Khalid shot at the security guard and was himself consequently shot in retaliation in self-defense. The prince eventually died from the bullet wound. This incident would become a key trigger to a very tragic incident that would unfold 10 years later. Yet despite the growing and relentless opposition movement from conservative factions within the kingdom, King Faisal continued to pursue his objectives and would always defend his policies by referring back to sound Islamic principles. However, unlike many of his contemporaries, King Faisal readily acknowledged his country's religious and cultural diversity, which included the predominantly Shia region of Asa in the east and the southwestern region of Asir. King Faisal's policies were inclusive and applied equally to the various religious subgroups and denominations. However, the dark stain of slavery was yet to vanish from the Desert Kingdom, and on November 6, 1962, the institution of slavery was totally abolished in Saudi Arabia. King Faisal had long felt such conviction about this cause. He previously stunned the American establishment upon visiting President Roosevelt in 1943, when he emphatically insisted that his black assistants should be seated on the same table and eat the same food that was being served to him in an area of the restaurant that was reserved for white people only. In an era of enthusiastic Arab nationalism and popular communist revolt, King Faisal was defiantly anti-communist. He rejected all political advances from the Soviet bloc, declaring that Islam is completely incompatible with the godless tenets of communism. King Faisal associated communism with Zionism, an ideology which he also criticized sharply. King Faisal was an active advocate for Islamic unity. He sought to counter the influence of socialism and Arab nationalism within the region.
Sequence of events he would like to see now in the Middle East.
King Faisal was an ardent advocate for the Palestinian struggle. He used his authority and political voice to advance the message at an international level. In his famous speech delivered at the UN in 1947, the king addressed the Western audience with the following proposition: "If you want to be generous, then be generous with what you possess." He then urged the West not to treat the Palestinians as if that country had no owners, and as if her rightful inhabitant had no say in the matter. But for all his bravery on behalf of the Palestinians, King Faisal was insulted, shoved, booed, and spat upon by Jewish demonstrators in New York. Yet after many diplomatic attempts coupled with sequential breaches of contract by the US and the UN over the Palestinians' affairs, King Faisal took matters into his own hands and made it very clear that his concern for the Muslims in Palestine was not a matter of words alone.
Middle East war produced developments all over the world today. The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories. If the Arab countries keep that pledge, it would reduce their production by almost 50% in 1 year. There were diplomatic maneuvers at the United Nations.
Soon the Western world would stop taking oil for granted. And in October 1973, when the Arab-Israeli war began, King Faisal withdrew Saudi oil from the world markets as a strong sign of protest over the West's unrelenting and shameful support for Israel. King Faisal led the Arab oil embargo of 1973. This affirmative strategy increased the price of oil and was a primary contributing factor behind the 1973 energy crisis. It was to be the defining act of King Faisal's career, an act that gained him lasting prestige among many Muslims worldwide.
What does Nixon do? He orders Kissinger, Secretary of State, and Schlesinger, Secretary of Defense, to prepare to take over the Arab oil fields in Saudi Arabia.
And by 1974, he was named Time magazine's Man of the Year. The financial windfall generated by the oil crisis fueled the financial stream that continues to flow into the Saudi economy, long after his death. However, following the defeat of the Arab forces in 1973, towards the end of the Arab-Israeli war, King Faisal was never seen to smile publicly again due to his grief and his deep sadness over the state of Palestine and the loss of land inflicted on the indigenous people of Palestine. The king thus encouraged Muslims to rise up and liberate the Holy Land in an emotional speech.
إن القدس الشريف يناديكم ويستغيث بكم أيها الإخوة.
King Faisal was respected and highly regarded by his peers and contemporaries. He had invited Malcolm X to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as a guest of the state and accorded him a generous and honorable reception for the duration of his pilgrimage in the Holy Land. King Faisal also developed a close alliance with Pakistan, where he was regarded highly for his religious policies and Islamic ideals. He was a very close friend of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the renowned Prime Minister of Pakistan, as well as General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq. In fact, in 1979, Lialpur, which is Pakistan's third largest city, was renamed Faisalabad, which means the city of Faisal. This was in honor of the legacy of the King of Saudi Arabia. King Faisal's personal life was unique compared to that of his predecessors and to many of his contemporaries. King Faisal was monogamous all of his life and was married to Queen Afat. She was a very educated young woman whom he had met in Turkey. She was in fact fluent in French and was a very confident personality. She was the first Saudi woman to be named queen. Together, they had championed the education of females, having established the very first female schools in the kingdom. King Faisal's daily routine was very consistent. He would wake up early for prayers and would kneel down as a servant in prostration before God. He habitually instructed people to address him as Brother Faisal instead of His Royal Highness. King Faisal also had witnessed much of the outside world during his lifetime. He took English lessons and understood it enough to be able to correct his translators during interviews. Yet despite his ability, he preferred to communicate in Arabic. He was a deep reader and would station himself behind his desk, consuming information, sometimes 6 or 7 days in a row. He never lost his composure and was known to say, "God gave us 2 ears and 1 tongue, that we should listen twice as much as we talk." And by the end of 1974, Times magazine named King Faisal as Man of the Year. Reporters described him as da'wah, ascetic and shrewd. But within days of this article having been printed, King Faisal reportedly had 2 distinctive dreams that were to prove true in the following months. In one of his dreams, he was informed by his grandfather that it was time to meet his mother, who had died when he was only 7 years old. In his second dream, he saw his grandfather, his sister, and his eldest brother. All of them had forced him into a car and drove away. Upon relating his dreams to his aunt, he had expressed a concern that he did not think he would live to see the end of the new year. On March the 25th, 1975, King Faisal arrived in his office at 10:25 a.m. He had an appointment to meet Kuwait's new oil minister, who was waiting in a side room next to the king's office. Along with him was also the Saudi finance minister, Zaki al-Yamani. And along with them was a young Saudi prince who snuck into the waiting room with the two senior officers. When the door to King Faisal's office was opened at 10:32 a.m., the young prince walked in behind the two ministers. And when King Faisal leaned over to embrace his young nephew, at that very moment, the young man took out a pistol and shot 6 rounds of close range. The first shot hit the king's chin, piercing his throat and ripping through his jugular vein. The second bullet went through his ear and grazed his temple. The king's dream had now come to light. He was assassinated by his own nephew. King Faisal was quickly taken to hospital. He was still alive as doctors massaged his heart and gave him a blood transfusion. However, due to the severity of the injuries, the doctors were not successful in their operation, and King Faisal died shortly thereafter. It is reported that both before and after the shooting, King Faisal remained calm. Later that day, a radio newscaster held back his tears long enough to tell the nation that King Faisal had been brutally assassinated that morning. Following the murder of King Faisal, Riyadh observed 3 days of mourning, and all government activities were to stand still. The assassin was Prince Faisal al-Musaid, a 24-year-old graduate returning from the U.S. He was the younger brother of Khadid al-Musaid, the very same prince who was shot dead in 1966. The assassin was captured directly after the attack, and the nation's high court convicted him of murder and had sentenced him to death. Yet within Saudi Arabia and in the wider Muslim world at large, it is commonly believed that King Faisal's oil boycott was the real cause of his assassination, and that the young assassin was a willing agent acting on behalf of a foreign agency. King Faisal's body was buried a day following his death. He was laid to rest in an unmarked grave at Al-Ud Cemetery in Riyadh on March 26, 1975. As we move through history, another towering figure emerges from the Arab world. A leader whose vision and decisions reshaped his nation and left a lasting mark beyond its borders. Like King Faisal, he was a reformer, but his bold choices made him an even bigger target. Only 2 years after the signing of the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, President Anwar Sadat was murdered by members of an armed extremist group in October of 1981. Why this happened will soon become very clear. Born into a household of 13 siblings on 25 December 1918, Anwar Sadat grew up among ordinary Egyptian villagers in the town of Mit Abu Qam, 40 miles to the north of Cairo. By the time of his birth, Egypt had become a British protectorate. His grandmother instilled in Sadat a deep affection for Egyptian heritage by narrating tales of Arab strength and dignity before the British came to seize the land. From a young age, Sadat was an enthusiastic reader. Among the books and periodicals he consumed were accounts of Mahatma Gandhi's resistance against the British in India, a struggle Sadat revered and later sought to imitate. Anwar Sadat's political rise started with his enrollment in the military academy. As a result of the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Agreement, entry to the military academy was no longer limited to the elite class. For the first time, the National Military Academy was accessible to sons of the working class. The impact was to merge in the military the very groups that were most politically engaged in Egypt and most desperate for a shift in the current state. These sons of clerks, junior officers, and small traders carried into the officer ranks the anti-imperial passion then widespread on the streets of Cairo. At the military academy, Anwar Sadat met Gamal Abdel Nasser, beginning a lasting political partnership that eventually led to the Egyptian presidency. In the years after he joined the academy, Sadat was involved in many political groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood, the fascist Young Egypt, and a covert military organization called the Free Officers, which aimed to free Egypt from British dominance. In the early 1940s, during the Second World War, the Nazis led by Adolf Hitler and their ally Italy began attacking Libya, compelling Britain to deploy Egyptian forces to guard the western boundary of British land. However, some Egyptian troops, including Sadat, wished to align with the Nazis in exchange for assistance in eliminating British rule from Egypt. And so, in 1941, Sadat and other officers began to scheme a revolt with the aid of the Nazis. When the British uncovered Sadat's schemes, he was stripped of his military position and imprisoned. While languishing in prison, Sadat learned English by reading newspapers and books, and he also learned German from another inmate. After 2 years behind bars, Sadat tried to break out. His initial attempt failed, but his second in 1944 succeeded. Evading the authorities, he lived as a fugitive, adopting the name Hajj Muhammad, growing a beard to alter his appearance, and working as a garage technician. Anwar Sadat soon resumed his plans to oust British dominance over Egypt. He orchestrated one assassination attempt on Egypt's prime minister at the time, but the effort was unsuccessful. Another assassination attempt, this time successful, led to the death of Egyptian political figure Amin Osman Pasha, who supported a union between Egypt and Britain. For his involvement in Pasha's murder, Sadat was once again jailed in January of 1946. Anwar Sadat endured 2 years in detention before his trial, in which he was declared innocent. Upon his release, Anwar Sadat resumed his political actions, and in 1950, Gamal Abdel Nasser invited Sadat to join the Free Officers movement. This revolutionary group had expanded significantly while Sadat was in prison. On 23 July 1952, the Free Officers movement executed a coup d'etat, toppling the Egyptian monarchy. Anwar Sadat was selected to announce the coup leader's first statements on the radio. As a collective, the Free Officers were largely unfamiliar to the Egyptian public 4 months after the coup, and Sadat was not initially prominent among them. But as time passed, he assumed a public role as an intense propaganda chief for the uprising. He was appointed editor of Al-Gumhuriya, the daily publication created as a regime mouthpiece in 1953. Sadat became a vocal adversary of Western imperialism, with Gamal Abdel Nasser soon fortifying his authority and eliminating dissent. Sadat faithfully backed the dominant leader. As internal political struggles grew within the leadership of the Free Officers, from the expulsion of General Mohammed Naguib in 1954 to the dismissal of the military heads after the catastrophic Six-Day War of 1967, Anwar Sadat seemed disengaged from the conflict. Derisive cartoons of him surfaced in the media, and jokes circulated about the low regard Sadat commanded among his peers. Although he was appointed Speaker of the National Assembly in 1959 and Vice President in 1969, very few people considered him a serious candidate for leadership, but I'll revisit this later. Meanwhile, while collaborating with Gamal Abdel Nasser, Sadat learned the perilous art of politics in a world of superpower conflicts. Their most critical test came over the Suez Canal, which President Nasser nationalized in 1956. In a coordinated operation, the British, French, and the newly formed State of Israel launched an assault on Egypt, hoping to reclaim authority over the canal. The conflict concluded only after the United States pressured its allies to retreat. Egypt emerged from the conflict as a champion of the non-aligned nations, having successfully resisted colonial powers and retained its hold over the Suez Canal. However, Gamal Abdel Nasser's influence in the Arab world diminished greatly after the disaster of the Six-Day War in June 1967. In this war, the Israeli forces completely crushed the Egyptian air defenses and swept across the Sinai Peninsula to the Suez Canal, obliterating the Egyptian army. The war resulted in Israel's occupation of what remained of historic Palestine, as well as the Egyptian Sinai Desert and the Golan Heights from Syria. In a span of 6 days, the Israeli military inflicted a massive defeat on the forces of 3 Arab nations and seized land that was 3.5 times its area. A peace deal was eventually made between Israel and the Arab states, but Israel declined to return any of the territory captured during the conflict, including Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. The Six-Day War shattered the confidence of the Egyptian leadership and army, and Anwar Sadat himself stayed confined in his residence for days after the ceasefire. The destruction from the war also risked bankrupting the Egyptian administration. Internal conflicts among Arab states in the rising Palestinian movement eventually pushed Gamal Abdel Nasser's capabilities to the brink. In 1969, Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose health was rapidly deteriorating, selected Anwar Sadat as vice president of Egypt. President Nasser passed away 9 months later from cardiac arrest, and Anwar Sadat was voted president on 15 October 1970. When he took over from Nasser, Anwar Sadat was completely unfamiliar and unproven. Both Egyptians and foreign envoys questioned what kind of ruler Sadat would be. It has been widely claimed that the United States CIA predicted that Sadat wouldn't last more than 6 months in office before a stronger figure rose. However, Sadat started shaping his presidency within days of assuming power by altering policies that Nasser had established. For example, Sadat ended the regular surveillance of officials and permitted the media to report and broadcast without fear of suppression. Anwar Sadat astonished everyone with a sequence of clever political strategies through which he retained the presidency and emerged as a leader in his own right. He launched what he termed the Corrective Revolution on May 15, 1971, through which he set out to cleanse the government and security services of all Nasser loyalists, especially those who favored the Soviet Union. Sadat first ousted Ali Sabri, the head of the air defense system, who was known for his strong links to the Soviet Union. Then, another senior official, Sharawi Goma, was dismissed, sparking a mass resignation of top-tier government officials devoted to both Sabri and Goma. Anwar Sadat quickly accepted their resignations, publicized the news, and placed the entire group under home detention. That same night, Anwar Sadat assembled a fresh government, filling the vacant roles with individuals he believed were dedicated to Egypt above the Soviet Union or their self-interests. The action against these once influential figures earned him applause from the public. Sadat's approval soared even higher when he reduced the powers of the widely despised secret police and began dismantling the police state built by Gamal Abdel Nasser and his pro-Soviet allies. Furthermore, he granted the Islamists independence in exchange for political backing. Sadat adopted the title of Believer President, arranged for mass media to cover his prayers at mosques, and started and ended his speeches with Quranic verses. Anwar Sadat also fostered the expansion of Islamic student associations, supported Islamic teachings in schools, and reached an agreement with the Muslim Brotherhood, allowing it to operate publicly again as long as it renounced violence. President Sadat also reversed foreign policies that had isolated Egypt from everyone but the Soviet Union and restored property and industries to private owners. Sadly, domestic and global crises presented Anwar Sadat with seemingly impossible challenges. The Egyptian economy continued to struggle from the war with Israel, and Egypt's ongoing ties with the Soviet Union worsened as the Soviets proved unreliable partners. When pressed for more military aid to replenish losses from the Six-Day War, the Soviets simply ignored Anwar Sadat's pleas. In a daring move that soon became his hallmark, Anwar Sadat expelled the Soviets. The decision to expel the Soviets was so unforeseen that it even startled the United States. As Sadat had requested nothing in return from the US for removing the Soviet advisors, Sadat's main goal was to lessen Egypt's reliance on a single foreign power. This bold action to expel the Soviets solidified internal support at a time when the average Egyptian was enduring severe hardships. The greatest challenge confronting Anwar Sadat was handling the fallout from the Six-Day War with Israel. Upon assuming leadership, he initiated peace negotiations with Egypt's long-standing enemy, Israel, almost right away. At first, Israel rejected Sadat's conditions, which suggested that peace could be achieved if Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula. Behind petroleum exporting countries, OPEC, decided to cut their oil output by 5%. They vowed to keep the same percentage of reduction each month afterward, until the Israeli forces were completely pulled out from all Arab lands taken during the 1967 June War, and the rightful claims of the Palestinian people were restored. The Arab nations also imposed a blockade on the United States, halting oil delivery. The decline in oil peace with the Israelis. He even confirmed that he would visit the Israeli parliament to argue for peace. In response, the Israelis sent an invitation for him to do exactly that, and Sadat's speech to the Israeli parliament triggered a renewed drive for peace. When he completed the speech, he received roaring applause both from the Israeli parliament and from the Israeli people. President Sadat returned to Cairo and was greeted by an energized public and a parliament that was nearly unanimously in favor of endorsing his moves. Without a doubt, Sadat's journey to Jerusalem was one of the most significant landmarks of the 20th century, becoming a foundation in the modern history of the Middle East. However, in the months that followed, negotiations with Israel, again mediated by the United States, stalled once more over the Palestinian matter and land conflicts. But a breakthrough soon appeared. In September of 1978, with the hope to finally conclude a peace deal once and for all, United States President Jimmy Carter invited Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begin to Camp David in the United States. For 11 days, the three leaders bargained, debated, and argued. Ultimately, on September 17, 1978, both sides, Israel and Egypt, managed to settle on a structure for peace. In essence, this structure dictated that Israel would carry out a complete pullout from the Sinai Peninsula over a 3-year timeline, while Egypt would establish full peaceful ties with Israel. The fact that there would be temporary agreements set up for the West Bank and Gaza, and for ongoing dialogue regarding the status of Palestinians and Jewish settlers in the seized territories was also mentioned. Egypt would also permit free movement for Israeli vessels through the Suez Canal. This structure was a crucial move in the peace journey, and it eventually led to the March 1979 signing of the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Pact. The treaty halted the state of conflict that had persisted between the two countries since 1948. Alongside Menachem Begin, Anwar Sadat was honored with the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1978. Peace with Israel was not without its sacrifices. Sadat couldn't persuade the Arab world that the Camp David Accords treated legitimate Palestinian rights fairly. This resulted in the withdrawal of financial aid from the Arab states, which in turn brought economic difficulties to Egypt. While Sadat's fame grew in the West, it declined in Egypt due to internal resistance to the treaty and worsening economic struggles. Sadat's fresh alliance with the West and his peace pact provoked substantial internal resistance, especially from radical Muslim groups. To them, the peace agreement with Israel was often seen as an opportunistic surrender to Israel and the United States that abandoned the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza. For some of the Egyptian Islamic radicals, the peace pact with Israel was proof presented on the global stage that Anwar Sadat needed to be eliminated from power at any cost. Simultaneously, President Sadat responded to mounting opposition to his rule by turning to autocratic control and outright suppression. In his most extreme action in September of 1981, President Sadat commanded the detention of more than 1,500 individuals from across the political landscape: Islamic militants, attorneys, physicians, journalists, university lecturers, and political adversaries. A few weeks later, on 6th of October 1981, it was a bright day when President Anwar Sadat, clad in army attire, observed a military parade to celebrate the triumph of his October 1973 campaign. During the festivity, Anwar Sadat gazed up at the heavens where the Egyptian Air Force Mirage jets were soaring while army troops and military vehicles marched by. Suddenly, a military vehicle carrying an assassination squad halted in front of the stage. A military officer, Khalid al-Islam Bouli, a soldier in the Egyptian military, was the first to step out of the vehicle. He started yelling and motioning furiously at President Sadat. In reaction to the disturbance, Anwar Sadat rose and shouted back to face the young officer. At this moment, al-Islam Bouli hurled explosives at the platform where Anwar Sadat and his assistants were seated before returning to the vehicle to grab his firearm and fire directly at the president. His comrades who had remained in the truck did the same and started shooting. These firearms that they had brought to the parade were meant to be only for display, but the attackers managed to sneak in bullets for their AK-47 automatic rifles. President Anwar Sadat was killed during this act. He was 63 years old. Few leaders in modern history have defied the West as boldly as this man. His name became synonymous with defiance and power. Unlike King Faisal and Sadat, he didn't just challenge his enemies, he waged open battles against Western influence and sought to reshape the global order. But tragically, he was killed in public, and, most heartbreakingly, by his own people. As we dive in, you'll uncover the hidden reasons behind his shocking elimination and why he was targeted. The great revolutionary leader went to seek shelter in a big drainage pipe, joined by a large number of bodyguards. When the National Transitional Council fighters arrived, they started shooting, ending the life of the long-hunted Gaddafi. Why did one of the most powerful and feared leader of the recent times end like this? And what could be the actual reasons he was targeted? This will soon become clear. Countless videos have covered the rise and fall of Muammar Gaddafi, but I personally feel that those videos do not provide enough reasons why he was actually targeted. As such, we will shift our focus to addressing this issue. Muammar Gaddafi, the great African revolutionary leader, was born on June 7, 1942, in Qasr Abu Hadi, Libya. He ruled Libya for 42 years, from 1969 to 2011. Sadly, his leadership ended when he was caught and killed on October 20th, 2011, after the Battle of Sirte. Considering the number of reasons why Muammar Gaddafi was killed, you might start to question if it was due to extreme dictatorship. And if so, you might also wonder what type of rule such a dictator had. He was killed after being blamed for many actions and attempts, especially his push to create an African gold-backed currency called the gold dinar. It's important to understand that he wasn't killed for humanitarian purposes, but for power, oil, and money. If Gaddafi had managed to establish this monetary system in Africa, the United States of America, Asia, and Europe would have been forced to buy oil and minerals in the African gold-backed currency, which would have increased sales. Gaddafi was forcefully promoting this plan through the African Union, especially when he became chairman in 2009. The idea was strongly rejected by Western powers because it would reduce the value of their currencies and harm their economies, leaving them with little or no control over African nations. In other words, Gaddafi's plans for Africa would have ended neocolonialism. NATO's mission to kill Gaddafi was similar to that of Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was executed by the US partly because he decided to sell his country's oil in euros instead of US dollars. The United States became worried and doubtful about the instability the gold dinar would cause to its economy. Hussein's choice to sell oil in euros was a major hit to the United States, made worse by the announcement that the dollar was the currency of the enemy. All these actions could have sparked another currency conflict, which in history was very common, especially within Western and Middle Eastern countries. According to the International Monetary Fund's report, Libya's central bank in 2011 held an estimated 144 tons of gold in its vaults. Muammar Gaddafi's plan was to launch a gold-backed currency, which he believed all African and Muslim nations would adopt. Although he had this vision, he felt it could be some sort of rivalry with the euro and dollars. You might ask how the United States discovered the gold dinar. A senior advisor to the US President, Sidney Blumenthal, informed his Secretary General Hillary Clinton through an email that Gaddafi's government was holding 143 tons of gold and a similar amount of silver in their bank. In late March 2011, these reserves were moved southwest toward Libya's border with Niger and Chad. The situation intensified when former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, who also had interests in Libya, found out about the country's gold and silver. He then took steps to attack Libya. Some of Sarkozy's goals were to secure a share of Libyan oil production, increase French influence in Libya and North Africa, improve his political standing in France, give the French military a chance to regain its global status, and block Gaddafi's plans to free Francophone Africa from harmful French control. Hillary Clinton, who was the US Secretary of State at the time, after learning this, worked to stop the creation of such a currency in Africa. This strong currency would have helped Africa break free from the last heavy chains of colonial exploitation on the continent. The reportedly leaked email from Hillary Clinton had serious effects on the fragile state of post-colonial relations with the West. If this is to be compared to anything, it's a wake-up call. While Africa tries to build an independent economic structure, the West is seen trying to destroy those efforts to keep its dominance in world affairs. That is why Gaddafi met an unexpected death, because of his goal to give Africa and Muslim states a new currency. Gaddafi's aim for this new currency was to direct oil profits into state-controlled funds instead of American banks. In other words, it was designed to end the use of the dollar for oil trades in African nations, especially Nigeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Angola. In fact, these countries were ready to switch their currencies as soon as the gold dinar was introduced. Unfortunately, in March 2011, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, launched a military operation in Libya under the name of Freedom and Humanitarian Concerns. Unfortunately, many ignorant Libyans listened and trusted the Western media instead of supporting their leader. Gaddafi managed to rule Libya for over 42 years because he was able to win the backing of many Libyan tribes by giving them free water, nearly free fuel, free healthcare, and low-cost and affordable education. Gaddafi's death marked the collapse of an African vision. Muammar Gaddafi wanted to avoid American control in his oil trades by using the golden dinar. He started a project for this currency, and other African countries were ready to show him huge support. This was an African vision, but at the same time, it was going to be a disaster for Western banks, which greatly profit the USA and most European nations. Let's explore other reasons that led to the killing of Muammar Gaddafi. Aside from all that you have seen about why Muammar Gaddafi was killed, as a strong and very energetic leader, adored by the people of Libya, there were things Gaddafi did for the people, which were not acceptable in the eyes of his rivals. 1. In Libya, there was no fee for electricity during Gaddafi's rule. Power was free for all citizens. Fuel, education, and healthcare were almost free or very cheap for most Libyans to afford. 2. With excellent handling of oil profits, the Libyan state had been able to save hundreds of tons of around 143 tons of gold, according to WikiLeaks, and the same quantity of silver. All these assets were going to make Libya the most powerful nation in Africa, overtaking France, for example. 3. There was no interest on loans in Libyan banks and state-run financial institutions. Loans were given at 0% interest by law. 4. Owning a house was a basic need for all Libyans. Gaddafi even promised that his parents wouldn't get a home until everyone in Libya had one. In fact, owning a house in Libya was treated as a human right. 5. All newly married couples in Libya received funds from the government to build their new homes. 6. Basic goods were handed out freely or at very low prices to Libyans to improve their lives, among other benefits. All these actions were viewed as offensive and authoritarian by those who opposed Gaddafi's programs, which eventually led to some conflict and the later killing of Libya's revolutionary leader. All these additional reasons why Gaddafi was killed are sourced from the Muslim Times media platform. Gaddafi even built the world's largest water supply project in Libya, the Great Man-Made River. This project used massive pipes to carry clean water from the Nubian sandstone aquifer system across Libya. And it was fully paid for by the Libyan government, without loans from the IMF or China. Sadly, NATO forces deliberately and under strict commands destroyed this water system and even went further to destroy the factory where the pipes for this project were produced. This was a project meant to help Libyans, so why ruin it if your goal is to free the same Libyans? We can't ignore the fact that Muammar Gaddafi had his personal flaws, but what is widely recognized about him by people in Libya and Africa was that he was on the edge of freeing Africa from foreign control. Many sources presented different views on the true reasons why Gaddafi was killed, usually based on what they understood about the whole idea of creating a new currency in Africa. Several writers and analysts describe Gaddafi as a populist. He was well known for appearing on TV many times to respond to questions from the people. As a highly respected figure, Gaddafi controlled Libyan politics for 40 years and was the center of a widespread personality cult. He was honored with many awards and praised for his anti-colonial stance, support for Arab and later African unity, and his major contributions to Libya's growth. Gaddafi turned Libya into a new socialist state in 1977. He officially took on a symbolic role in government, but stayed in charge of both the military and the revolutionary committees responsible for monitoring and silencing dissent. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization's forces were involved in Gaddafi's capture, while the Libyan military was also present to strengthen defense. The NATO forces started shooting at a pipeline hideout where Gaddafi was hiding, injuring him on the leg and back. According to one unnamed National Transitional Council fighter, one of Gaddafi's loyal guards also shot him, seemingly to save him from being captured. A few minutes later, as the fighting went on, Muammar Gaddafi was killed. Several videos of his death were broadcast on TV and spread across the internet. The leader was killed alongside his son, Muammar Gaddafi, and they were buried a few days after their assassination.